Hello, I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and welcome to Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. Today we meet a man that's taking on Big Pharma. A former addict and now author and activist, Ryan Hampton, in his new book, Untitled, gives an account of the fight for justice on behalf of millions of Americans. The opioid epidemic exposed a vast sort of underworld of corporate greed, manipulation, and outright lies that basically traded human lives for profit. Reconciling that tragedy is a complicated effort made understandable by our guest and his new book, Ryan Hampton. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Peter, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your journey, what brings you here, and the importance and significance of this new book, Unsettled.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for the intro. Most importantly, I'm a person in recovery from a substance use disorder, also known as addiction. My recovery date's February 2nd, 2015. I'm also an author. I'm an activist, community organizer. I run two nonprofits that are dedicated to curbing the overdose crisis in the United States. And this is kind of an interesting time for me because towards the end of each year is when I get ready to celebrate my recovery anniversary. 7 years ago, actually at this moment, I was homeless on the streets of Los Angeles looking for help. And Thanksgiving Eve 2014 was able to access help through a public treatment facility. And after getting into recovery, it wasn't my own journey of not being able to find treatment, not being able to find housing, not being able to find employment, all things of which I was able to get back in my life. But it was watching friends of mine die from these preventable overdoses, die from prescription overdoses, die from fentanyl overdoses, being turned away at hospital rooms and being told there was no room for them in treatment, that I really started to get more involved in activism and advocacy around this issue because I was really upset. It was kind of one of the ways I dealt with grief. And throughout that journey, which started in earnest in 2015, I was kind of led to this, larger system, right? An understanding of how we got into the crisis we're in. And that led me to the doorsteps of Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. When I was on the streets homeless, I didn't know who Purdue was. I didn't know who the Sacklers were. I'd been taking their medications for some time. My addiction kicked off in the early 2000s as a result of a Purdue prescription, but really set my sights on them and held several actions, several rallies with parents who had lost loved ones and people who had been impacted and told we didn't matter. Understood that this crisis was way bigger than just one person making, quote unquote, a bad decision. Many of us were led, unwittingly into addiction through legal prescriptions, through the mismarketing and the mismanagement and the criminal actions of Purdue and people sitting in a boardroom. And we didn't know it when it was happening. But that led me ultimately to the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy. In September of 2019, I was appointed by the Department of Justice as a result of my advocacy and as a result of my first book, which really explored kind of the origins of how we got here and what people need to get better. And the Department of Justice appointed me to a 9-member committee that kind of served as a watchdog throughout the process. And I thought, justice would be served, kind of like you see in the comic books that, the villains, go away, they get what's coming to them and everybody else wins. And
it's a fascinating story because looking at your first book, I can show up on screen.
Oh, you have it right there, American Fix.
Yeah, American Fix. It's a fascinating read. It's an in-depth look at, we can talk about later, what, how it became sort of a white middle class problem. And that's when it finally got attention. Yeah. And I thought, in leading up to your new book, I think I've seen you say that you felt sort of naive after your first book because what you thought were really the problems were really bigger and much more organized, sort of a predatory threat to Americans than we ever knew.
Yeah, I think coming out of American Fix, I had almost a little bit of a simplistic view in terms of the cause of how we got here. Right? How did we get to a place where just a couple of weeks ago, we've hit 100,000 overdose deaths, which we've never had before in this country. For every 8 COVID deaths, there's 1 overdose death, right? But the answers started to come to me throughout Unsettled, The Journey in Unsettled, my new book, and also throughout the journey in the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy. People who are impacted, family members who are impacted, the services that we need, the justice we need, the capacity that we need to provide help to people, the infrastructure, it's non-existent. It's not there. And there's not much more effort, I think, in building a system that welcomes everybody who needs help, right? I experienced in the case, even though I think a lot of government institutions and state attorneys general and public officials who I think are well-intentioned on the issue talk about all the work they're doing and holding these companies accountable. Behind closed doors, I mean, I was told, and I detail it at Unsettled, that people like me and people who've been impacted, that we don't really deserve a seat at the table in how these systems are built, because we did this to ourselves. We're nothing more than addicts.
These are great points, and that sort of renaissance in your viewpoint is something I'd like to address in the next break. We're going to take a short break and continue our conversation with Ryan and his fascinating story about the opioid epidemic. See you all after the break. You don't want to miss this.
The black truck? Hey, Christina from accounting.
Yeah, hi.
Hey, I used to date a girl named Christina.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then she dumped me for my best friend. You want to see some photos of them that I took?
I don't.
I thought we talked about this, buddy.
Buzz and overshared again?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna call a car.
That's a smart idea.
So yeah, I know, that's why I did it.
Hey, you're gonna get back to the top of the mountain.
Does that mean I'm gonna get back with Christina?
No.
Oh.
No.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and we're talking with Ryan Hampton about the opioid epidemic, his new book, and the great deception that has cost over 500,000 Americans their lives already with no end in sight, and created a culture of addicts relatively helpless. Ryan, tell us more about this journey you've been through and how we really need to address some of these problems.
Well, I think, at the heart of it, people who, you've used the word addicts, and folks have, kind of throw that word around liberally, but like at the heart of it, we're really people, right? Like we are people who need help. We're people who suffer from a chronic healthcare condition. We're people, when the appropriate treatment and the appropriate support is available to them, we get better, we get well, right? Like we live productive lives. We're members of society. We pay taxes. We vote. Many of, some of us run for office. We get involved in our communities. We write books, right? I've written 2 books. 7 years ago I was homeless, but this was because things for me, I lucked out into the services that I needed, right? The evidence is there, right? So the evidence is there on what we need to do. The United States Surgeon General in 2016 published the first ever Surgeon General's report on alcohol, drugs, and health. It stated that if we can get people past year 5 into sustained recovery, they have an 85% chance at maintaining that recovery for the rest of their life. That's a pretty good statistic, better than cancer, better than heart disease, if we get people the healthcare that they need. Yet the system is built, right, and has been for a long time, to only deal with this as an acute crisis. So it's like, let's get people treatment, and then we don't do anything after that, right? We have the data, we have the science that says long-term peer support services, recovery coaching, recovery housing, medication, mental health care, like providing these services to people gives them the best route out. But in the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy, as for folks who read it in Unsettled, I talk about how I fought with these very powerful institutions armed with the data, and was being told by state attorneys general, Department of Health and Human Services, some of the same institutions that provided this data, that they disagreed with their own data, that they didn't want to fund those services, that they wanted to fund the same things that they had been funding for a long time, which in my opinion were rife with conflict, right? If what we were doing to abate the opioid crisis and the overdose crisis was working in this country, we wouldn't be looking down the barrel of 100,000 deaths in 2020 alone, and a number that's going up. So like my rage, which I think comes out on paper, not just in American Fix, but on Unsettled, is really based around the fact that they are not listening to us when we know what works, right? None of this opioid litigation money is going to make a dent if we keep throwing new money after bad money, right? We know that if we don't rebuild this system and this infrastructure, more people will continue to die. And then they blame us for dying, right? They say it's our fault. This is a healthcare problem, just like any other healthcare problem in this country. Until we start dealing with it that way, things will continue to get worse. Not even to mention how the 130,000 individuals, the victims who were harmed by Purdue, were completely sidelined in this entire process.
You know, it's sad to look at this outcome because we see a whole generation of youth growing up to understand there has to be social compassion for people. They understand for the first time ever that addiction is a disease and something that needs to be treated as such, respectfully, not stigmatized as something that only influences bad people or makes people bad. You know, that vulnerability is so ever present. And this case, in reading in your book, I'll show a quick picture of Unsettled. I highly recommend it to our viewers. It's so frustrating to see how the compassionate side of us is dismissed, even when they had the resources to distribute in that direction. Why is there this phobia by this big pharma and this the system to actually apply money to places that it's going to work? What impedes them? Is it just greed, so they don't want to set a precedent for future incidents?
Well, yes, I think there's a level of greed, even on the government's part, when it comes to dollars from the opioid settlements, and also in terms of how dollars are distributed. But it's also about power, right? And it's about how we've done things in this country for so long. There are a lot of profiteers, you could say, that are very powerful, that feed off of the addiction system. So it's, you know, big treatment, it's big pharma, it's big, you know, prison corporations, it's big criminal justice systems, it's big law. Like, these are all systems that have for a long time fed off of keeping people sick, right? It's even, you know, we now have evidence around prevention, what works best for youth, right? I know that the days of when I was receiving these messages, the prevention techniques weren't working, right? Like, we tried to scare people from using drugs. We now know that more of a peer-to-peer based approach, compassionate care, right? At the end of the day, when a youth is, or someone, a young person is about to use their first drug or take their first drink, there is not a police officer around to remind them or give them a coloring book, right, on what may happen with their lives, which is what we used to do. But a friend will be there, right? Usually another peer will be there, making sure that we have qualified, trained peers in schools of you know, that are age appropriate, is how we provide effective prevention. But nobody wants to hear about that because there's a lot of money being made on the way we used to do things.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation and get a closer look at how real solutions may look if we can find a way to make them work. See you all after the break.
Today, more than ever, you need fast, reliable internet. At Mediacom, we want you to know you can count on us. Our fiber-powered 100% gigabit technology network was built for the future. We have enormous capacity and power and 99.99% network reliability. So even though these are uncertain times, we're prepared. And you can be certain we'll keep your world connected.
Multiple studies have shown that marijuana can slow both driver reaction and response time, which can be really dangerous. He's here. He's here. Wait. What? I can't drive. Why? My. Oh.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. We're talking with Ryan Hampton, author of the new book, Unsettled, which gives an account of the fight for justice on behalf of millions of Americans, victims of the opioid epidemic. Ryan, you're on a roll, talking about what some of the solutions might be, what we need to do to make this work. let's keep going.
Yeah. You know, I want to point out, I write in detail in the book about something called the Emergency Relief Fund. At the beginning of the Purdue case, I took on the role on the committee, and I was subsequently elected the chair of this 9-member committee. And as part of my role in the committee, I had to sign a lot of bills, right? I had to sign a lot of contracts for consultants. And I was seeing these bills for $40 million, $50 million, $60 million to pay lawyers and consultants and professional fees. And early in the case, towards the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, I said, oh my gosh, like all this money's going out the door, nothing on the ground for services, nothing on the ground for people who have been impacted, and proposed this thing called the Emergency Relief Fund, which I worked on for over 6 months with the committee. And it would have been the largest infusion of cash, over $200 million at the time, into recovery support services, grief counseling services for families who had lost loved ones, harm reduction services for people who were still using drugs to keep them alive until they could find recovery. Because if people aren't alive, they can't get into recovery, right? They can't get help. Recovery support services such as housing, that we know has tremendous value and impact on people's lives. If people can't be housed in a safe place, stable recovery house, they have very little chance at staying sober, right? Things like job training, things like peer support, which we talked about earlier, evidence-based prevention, intervention services, street outreach to people who were still using drugs, who needed help like I was 7 years ago, and counseling for folks who had lost loved ones. $200 million that would have been distributed amongst equally amongst the 50 states, but it would have been a non-governmental, non-profit organization that would have done it. States couldn't control the money. That was my only fine line. We couldn't keep throwing money down systems that weren't working. We had to try something different. And this was something different based on evidence. That was a turning point for me in the case, because I thought it was a no-brainer, because we had all the documentation, we had all the proof that came from the government that said these things worked. And that emergency relief fund was killed. It was killed by some of the same state attorneys general from across the country who claimed that they were doing this for the right reason. You know why it was killed? Because this was never about providing services. This was never about justice for people who needed it, who needed help. This was about money. It was about who could recover as much money as possible and who had the power. Victims did not have the power. So coming out of this case, it will continue to be my fight. It'll continue to be this movement's fight, because there's a lot of us doing this work to make sure that those services that we advocated for during the bankruptcy are offered on an equitable basis to people who need help in Iowa, to people who need help in neighboring states, to people who need help all across this country, because it can be done. We just have to get loud about it, right? There's a lot of us out there who are impacted. If we started speaking up and demanding these solutions, we would get them. Sadly, stigma, shame, systemic prejudice and barriers against people who are in recovery, family members, and people impacted by addiction has prevented that. But I believe that is starting to change, because people are angry, and they should be.
Well, it just amazes me that you're trying to do something to help people that are at risk, and they're identifiable. They're out there. Mm-hmm. And all that money is going to a white collar industry, legal consulting and everything else, doing a lot of talking without anything reaching the ground. It's like trying to feed people, but never providing food.
That is a crime. That situation with the Emergency Relief Fund was a crime in itself. It is a case study for greed and just, reckless. I have no problem with capitalism, but reckless capitalism. This was creating more disparity in healthcare, more disparity in wealth. The rich continue to get richer. Those who have nothing get less, right? And nothing changes except more people continue to die. And then the media portrays it as justice. This was nothing close to justice.
When we talk about people dying, and we can say that, so far the opioid epidemic's claimed well over 500,000 people, 500,000 Americans. Mm-hmm. Yet when you think about the impact on families, on relationships, and the overwhelming effect that there are probably tens of millions, or at least millions of people that are addicted to opioids
Right.
that haven't had an intervention. They haven't had an opportunity for healing. And this problem will be out there emerging at a regular basis, which is why the death rate keeps going up every year.
One quick statistic, and it was just released: 20 million Americans suffered from an addiction, a qualified addiction, substance use disorder in 2020. 1 in 3 American households are impacted directly by addiction, meaning they have someone in their family that is impacted. This is a way bigger issue than people think about, right? And then the economic, even if you're one of those 2 households that's not directly impacted, the economic impact of this is over $2 trillion per year to the economy. It impacts your social services, your health care, right? Your insurance. So we're all impacted one way or another. So we've got to start getting our act together and demanding some solutions, or else this is going to, the COVID curve is starting to come down the curve, but the curve on the overdose toll is just skyrocketing like we've never seen before. It's the second public health crisis we have in this country.
We're going to take a short break. And after this break, we're going to invite Ryan to share some final comments and insights that he's gained from his experience to add to those he's already shared. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss this.
Every second, 127 new devices connect to the internet. You can feel it happening. Our digital world expanding with every breath. We're entering a whole new era of connectivity, and MediaCom will be ready to power it with one of the nation's first 10G platforms. We'll be bringing you more speed, more capacity, more security, and the power to do more than you ever dreamed possible.
Whether it's advice on managing your anxiety or tools to help you stay grounded, Coping-19 provides a range of resources and self-care tips to help you cope with this pandemic. We can help. Find the resources that work best for you at coping-19.org.
Welcome back. Today on Surviving Bad, we're talking about how the opioid epidemic exposed the world of corporate greed, manipulation, and outright lies that traded human lives for profit. Our guest, Ryan Hampton, is dedicated to reconciling this tragedy for millions of Americans. Let's hear what lessons Ryan has to share. Ryan, it's your forum now. Share your ideas. Let people know what they need to do to change the world for the better.
Yeah, I would say, coming out of this case, and a lot of people have asked me after reading the book, they felt that kind of the fire in my belly may have gone out, but it hasn't, and I make it clear that while my experience in that case was maddening, and I think that my belief or my faith in the justice system, particular to the Big Pharma and Purdue, is tarnished. My belief in justice, my belief in equity, my belief that things will get better for this community, our community, people impacted, my belief that we can provide a roadmap for young people as they're navigating possible issues with addiction. It's never been stronger, right? I think that my agency to continue going comes from the fact that I see more people standing up and getting involved in this work, right? And it all starts really with sharing their own story. And that's what I leave people with whenever I have the chance, is to recognize that still, in today's day and age, many people don't have the ability to share their recovery story, to share how they've been impacted by addiction, to share how they've lost a loved one. If you're someone who, like me, who's in recovery or seeking recovery, like, discrimination is still very real. People can lose their jobs. People can lose their health care. People can be shunned in the criminal justice system. You can be turned away for life insurance based on your previous history with addiction, which makes it more important for those of us who can share our stories, for those of us who can get up and get active, for those of us who can take part in things like the Purdue bankruptcy or work on progressive forward-thinking, forward-leaning legislation that will help curb overdose deaths, it makes it more important for those of us who can stand up to do it for those who still can't, right?
Yeah, there's a generation of young children growing up that with media and the way it is, they're just exposed to so much of this stuff at a very young age.
Mhm.
And it's important in a real simplistic way that they learn lessons from other people's, let's just call them mistakes, not necessarily there's a fault there, but if they can learn from other people's stories, and if they can learn
Experiences.
from the journeys you've been on, they can save themselves the risk and the potential problems that they could face. And it's so important for this peer-to-peer culture and story-to-story culture and face-to-face human culture, even if it's done through the media, to get these messages out there like what you're doing.
Yeah, and the ground is shifting. I mean, I just have to say in the last few moments we have, the ground is shifting beneath us constantly in terms of substances and what's out there. So out of those 100,000 deaths last year, 63% of them were from illicit fentanyl, right? We have a fentanyl crisis in this country right now, which is an outcome of years of not dealing with this, right? Like the drugs are changing, they're becoming more deadly. People who aren't even addicted or have a substance use disorder who are trying the substance for the first time, just recreationally, are dying of fentanyl overdoses because they're receiving something that's laced with fentanyl. So we have a poisoned, very dangerous drug supply. People need to recognize that. And in terms of what we are doing with youth, and how we're approaching this, the most important thing that someone can do is be open about this conversation. If you need help, ask for help. There are places to go. The federal government locator, findtreatment.gov, find help. If you are a family member or a parent, please, please do not be ashamed to have this conversation. Your dinner table should be an open dialogue. You should have that relationship to be able to have these open discussions with your kids. Something I wish my parents would have done a long time ago, right? The more open we are, I think the better chance we have at preventing overdose death and preventing chaotic addiction and substance use disorder.
Thank you so very much, Ryan. What a great way to finish the show today. And thank you all for joining us. Check out our website, healthyiowa.org, for more information, and keep your eye on MediaCom MC22 for our next episode of Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. On MediaCom MC22, your local programming leader.